This evening, Dr. Ricardo Guthrie will be leading us in this summary and discussion. Dr. Guthrie?
Good early evening and afternoon to those of you who are with us. I just wanted to say I've been at Northern Arizona University for the last 12 years, came here in 2008, right before the housing collapse. And I think that much of what we're going to talk today relates to that whole idea that in the midst of turmoil and crisis, there still is a community, a beloved community that will thrive and survive regardless of the obstacles that we face. So I was just going to introduce myself as by that. And then did we want to ask other people to talk at this time, Reverend Lewis?
If there is there anyone, Sister Kara, do you have anything that you would like to share with us before we officially get started?
No, just to thank everyone again for being here this evening. I will note, just because of the number of folks that we have here today, we will not be breaking into breakout rooms for our discussion. We'll just stay as one group. So throughout Dr. Guthrie's presentation, as you come up with questions, feel free to pose them at the end of his presentation, and then we'll launch right into our discussion with the facilitators. So Dr. Guthrie, I hand it right back to you.
All right, excellent. I appreciate that. And again, thank you all for being in here in the, what is it, the Zoom partition that we've become so used to. I'm hoping this helps facilitate our engagement. And again, I appreciate those who are covering time and distance to be with us. So we've titled this talk, Race, Space, and Segregation. And I added the words in the historic South Side, particularly because it talks about the history of segregation as part of the African-American experience. It doesn't mean that other people weren't segregated, but it does mean the laws, the policies, and the practices are based on race, and specifically on racial groups who are considered African-Americans, Afro-Americans, Negroes, etc. We say Blacks these days, or Africana, or African diaspora, but we all know who we're talking about. And so the specific idea here is that there's a type of desegregated experience that we're experiencing now. And I don't think it means exactly what we had hoped. It doesn't mean that the elimination of segregation means now that we're free. It just means a different form of segregation, I'm afraid. So I do use that word desegregated still more than 60 years after the official end to segregation in Flagstaff. And so I'll just tab through this discussion, and then afterwards I'll share with you my my policy paper if that will help with the discussion. Okay. So you all have passed by the Murdoch Center at different times, or if you haven't, then let me introduce to you the idea of the Murdoch Center being the former location of a segregated school called the Paul Laurence Dunbar School. And on this wall, we see some of the heroes and sheroes who have helped develop that community and turn it from an era of being segregated and discriminated against into an area of congregation and of success. And those are just some of the heroes and sheroes on the wall that we'll talk about a little bit later. Again, I'm using Southside, the area south of the tracks, as my focal point because that is the largest area where African Americans have resided historically. And so why would we talk about segregation as if it's a good thing? Well, George Lipsitz, one of my mentors who's done sociology and history, says, when we try to express ourselves, wherever we may be, we use the type of culture that we have available to us to create a new memory, even in the midst of despair or segregation or discrimination. And so this mural is dedicated to that idea that if we work together and express ourselves, tell our story, no matter how good or how bad, we actually find a way out of no way. And we transform these spaces into real places, right? Space is the empty vacuum of places where we reside. So race, space, and segregation describes that emptiness that we're now filling with possibility. And one of these ways was using a mural and street signs that the people of the neighborhoods in the South Side said, we need to be able to define ourselves by that place. and not just the empty vacuum south of the railroad tracks. So what is the South Side? It is the home to where most Black people lived for most of the 20th century, and still we have that legacy today. And on that South Side venue, we have the experience shown where people lived, where they worked at the lumber mills, the different racially colored hands that linked together because we had Blacks, Latinos, Native Americans, and whites all living south of the railroad tracks and working together. So when I was developing this issue statement, I mentioned that Flagstaff does have a documented history of redlining, in which the banks and the city circumscribed the neighborhoods where Blacks lived so that they couldn't get the access to the loans and to the financial support they might need from the city or from private business. And so that was called redlining. And it made it very difficult then to build your own home, to grow and advance using the financial resources that were typically reserved for other people who were considered full citizens. Even veterans experienced redlining based on the color of their skin. So there's a documented history of that in Flagstaff. And there were other socioeconomic practices and policies which created a pattern of segregation and discrimination against Blacks and other peoples of color within the city. And again, this is just not, okay, I'm gonna be in the same neighborhood as my Black friend or my family, or I'm Asian, so I like to be with other Asians, or I'm Hispanic, I like to be with other Mexicans, etc. No, that's not segregation. That might be group cohesion and enclaves, but segregation is a policy of discrimination, which said you will be separate and therefore unequal. Not just that you have your own neighborhoods, but that neighborhood will not have the finances or the resources the rest of the city have. So it's a very important piece to say, because people say, why do you self-segregate? Why do you all eat in the same lunchroom or go to the same restaurant? It's not that. That's something else that we'll talk about. So is history of redlining and discrimination against Blacks actually helped the city? Because while you were underserving Blacks in the South Side, you could use that money north of the tracks to build up the downtown, to give to other people who were building their own homes and their businesses. So growth and development that occurred as a result of racial exclusion and segregation during much of the 20th century were contributing factors to the erasure and the lack of representation of Blacks within the city proper. It didn't mean that Blacks were unhappy south of the railroad tracks. They had their churches, they had their schools, they had their work sites, they had their homes, they had each other. That was all there. That was all very true. But the reality was some of the factors meant that you could then ignore them because they were south of the border, south of the railroad tracks, excuse me. You could ignore them from the city services and the other representations on the city council and elsewhere because they were in the South Side. And it may not have been of more than 15 or 10,000 people at a time during most of the 20th century, but it was a cohesive community that did not have adequate representation. I think there was one Black policeman at the time. And he was there to ensure that people didn't go north of the border, north of the railroad track. So the absence of Black culture and the historical structures outside of South Side is a continuing problem because this lack of visibility leads to planning and policies that fail to address the impacts of those policies on African Americans, and it also undermines their contributions overall. So Flagstaff demographics, as you know, indicate a growing segment of Native Americans, of Latinx, Mexicans, Hispanics, of growing Asian American populations, and African Americans. So if whites were at 90%, they might be down to 65% with larger numbers of Native Americans, Hispanics, Asians, and then Blacks. And so officially we might say it's 2% or 3% of Blacks, and then another 6%, two races or more than one race, of which some will be Black as well. And I just want to indicate that borderline of 2% or 3% of Blacks is generally what we say is where the Black community is. And you know, though, their pockets are much larger in the South Side and Sunny Side and the areas that we're going to talk about. And it's also larger on campus, by the way, the percentage of African Americans within the student population. So these demographics have been used to say, well, since you're not here, you don't deserve the services anyway. What are you complaining about? Well, the reality is the work that the people did for the lumber mills, for the restaurants, for the businesses were far out of proportion to their numbers. They always were. And we've talked about this earlier during some of our presentations. Black lumberjacks and lumber mill workers, Mexican lumberjacks, Native American lumberjacks, they were far out of proportion to the rest of their population. They inundated those work sites, and they would have populations, again, like 20 or 30%, where in the rest of the city was far less than that. So now we're here in the Flagstaff area. We work at the university, we work in the medical center, we work in the private sector and entertainment or hospitality industries. But growth overall has remained stagnant because there is a lack of jobs. There are fewer affordable and adequate housing available for our growing populations and limited cultural opportunities for people of color. We're very proud of some of our business owners who will take care of your haircuts, right? Like Mr. Cuts. We're very proud of that, to be able to do that. But what does it say? When there are few barbers available, right, in this city, that you might have to go to Phoenix or Tucson or LA to get your head done if you can't get into Mr. Cuts. What does that say? It means there's a lack of opportunity. And then for him, that means a greater chance to expand his business because there's a great demand for that. But adequate housing is not here. Limited culture opportunities. And segregation as a thematic construct, a way to devise and describe our lives, really does talk about the built environment in ways that are, like I say, positive, in many ways that are negative. It's an underexplored aspect of this small mountain town, you know, less than 80,000 people, that's pretty small, that seeks to embrace growth and change. And so as I go through this discussion, when we get a chance to open up and talk more, I'm going to talk about, I'll try to keep it to 5 points, okay? The legacy of segregation. And if you're taking notes, I'm saying segregation as a legal construct and a social custom construct. The legality, de jure, and the social construct, de facto, they both work together and they are just as strong. Just because you can't see a law on the books doesn't mean that people already know how they should treat you based on the unwritten laws. So the history of segregation will be approached from a pro and con perspective. 2, growth and development within these demographic shifts. It's very clear that Arizona is going to be a majority Latinx population state by 2025 or 2030. I mean, we may already be there because of undercounts. And as a result, those demographic shifts will affect how you elect a governor, who you have in the legislature. And yes, it'll affect little old Flagstaff as well, even if we don't grow past 100,000 or 110,000. I mean, we probably will. But right now, the demographic destination is Latinx people becoming the majority in the state. And if you think there'll be a shift in power, you're darn right, there will be. But the question is, will there be an electoral system that will allow that to happen so that little old Flagstaff and other areas can then benefit from it as well? We'll wait and see. So growth and development within these demographic shifts is number 2. Number 3, we know this, the relocation of the Rio de Flag. That Flag river floods on I guess they say a 90-year cycle. And we say it's often more often than that, but when it floods, it inundates the south side and makes it very difficult then to develop in the area without having proper insurance. And so when the Rio de Flag is relocated, and it will be relocated, that's going to affect Southside in very tremendous ways. The good thing will be then you will be able to develop your house. The bad thing is it might be more expensive than you probably can afford. But it has to happen and it will happen. And so number 3 is when the relocation of the Rio de Flag goes down, will the people here be able to benefit from that? Or if you want to do it in a positive way, how will people be able to benefit from it? I think I like that approach better. Number 4, Northern Arizona University. That's our big neighbor. And so what does NAU have to do with neighborhood empowerment? I think it could play a positive role. Remains to be seen, but I think it's part of one of the elephants in the room in terms of what the future of a society that is trying to overcome segregation will look like in Flagstaff. And then number 5, again, I'll just try to keep it to 5, the city itself. The city of Flagstaff and its resource allocations can sway depending on who you have in office, right? You can have a mayor and a city council who are working in conjunction to empower communities, or you can have a mayor and a city council who are at odds and make it very difficult for the neighborhood empowerment to develop. So I'll talk more about that when we get to the end of the discussion, but those last 2 segments, the NAU and the city, are the 2 big elephants in the room, I would say, as we move forward. Okay, so I'm moving on to the next piece here. The context for what we're talking about. These are numbers from 1990, and they really haven't changed too much. There's some increase in population, obviously, but in terms of the percentages that we see here, this still remains true. And this is a direct outcome, legacy of segregation. The neighborhoods that we're talking about, and this again is not all of Flagstaff, but it's close enough. Sunnyside, Southside, which is broken into 3 areas, Plaza Vieja, which really deserves its own location, and Pine Knolls, well, we consider part of that the greater, let's call it greater Southside. And as a result, you can see these numbers are just off the charts. 81% of the folks in Southside were part of this low to moderate income, which is just about $11,000 compared to the rest of the city, which is twice that, or almost 3 times that, 28,000. The median home value in Southside, as you can see, it's 64,000. This is from 1990. Again, it's much more now. But again, that's still not the same percentage across where Flagstaff is. And if you go down the charts here, you'll see Southside of Plaza Vieja and Pine Knolls, similar problems in terms of this gap between what's happening in the rest of Flagstaff compared to here. And again, part of this is the lack of salary jobs that would allow you to make $28,000 in 1990 terms. It's increased now. Again, I have to keep saying that, but still there is a gap. And these are part of the wealth gaps that we'll talk about later. And I think Mr. Lumpkins talked about this earlier when we had a previous presentation. So the low income concentrations, again, a distinct legacy of segregation, one of the negative outcomes. But also, let's look where the people of color live. Same thing. There are more African Americans in Southside, 7.2%, or Plaza Vieja, 5%, or Pine Knoll, 21%. Those are a lot of folks over there in the Cogdale recreation area, 21%. And again, these numbers are not large in terms of the overall city, since we only have like 70,000 people more or less. But these are percentages that we have to pay attention to, because when you say and you think of who Black people are and where they are, these are the numbers that strike you. 7% compared to 3% for the rest of the city, or 2% is what we've been told. Native Americans are definitely have higher percentages, and so do Hispanic or Latinos. And then the other is the category I like to look at. The other category is one race or two races or more, or biracial people. So if I'm Black and Latino, I might be in the other category, right? I may not count as Black. But when I do my census, I put Black first. I don't put the Hispanic first, because then they ask you, well, what race are you? And then you get split. So that's my strategy to increase the numbers for African Americans, but not everybody does that, right? This current generation will say, well, I'm other, I'm 2 or more. And therefore you go into the other category and the Black is an undercount. Well, I show up at work today, people look at me, well, what are you? What are your pronouns? And my pronouns will be Black, Hispanic, mixed race. That's what will happen. So I just want to say that 2% officially, but if you look at that other number, there's 8% or more who are other. And I'll bet you half of those people are Black. That's just my guess. So here's a legacy of segregation, I would say, on the positive side. Where the people of color live still are condensed into south of the Route 66. And this south of the Route 66, or south of the tracks, as I mentioned, we could call that the South Side, which has the linked racial and ethnic diversity. It has a name and a nomenclature, South Side, which is very, very common throughout most of the communities around the nation. In Chicago, there's a huge South Side. Milwaukee, there's a huge South Side. It's either South Side or East. I'm not sure why. East St. Louis, East Palo Alto. You're either south or to the east. Figure this out. And right above that, there's 10 or 12 different institutions, starting with the South Beaver School and the Dunbar School within the South Side, and the 4 Black churches, the Basque Tourist Home up on South San Francisco Street, NAU, of course, right in the center of things, as well as Our Lady.
Hey, turn that down, sir.
Thank you. Our Lady of Guadalupe. I had some theme music going there. And the Arizona Lumber and Timber. There were 3 or 4 different lumber mills in town. And when those jobs disappeared, it put a hurting on the South Side and Sunnyside and Plaza Vieja. And then right above that, I mentioned the heroes and sheroes. Some of these folks worked at the Dunbar School, such as Tilda Johnson and others who created preschools like Mother Hickman, and then others who became heroes and sheroes like Joan Dorsey, who became one of the first flight attendants for American Airlines, and TWA, has a very good storied history. And if you ever give her a chance to talk with her, you'll find that out. And then the men in the middle, Wilson Riles, who came from here and was just a lumberjack before he became the principal of the Dunbar School, and then went on to fortune in California as an instructor of education. And then Paul Laurence Dunbar, who was a poet laureate who could write in any genre at the turn of the century, for whom dozens of schools across the country were named. So the South Side of the track, that historic South Side, has this legacy, which is very powerful and productive. And as we mentioned before, if you look across the city, you won't find any other site that has Black faces in high places. Why is that? Well, it's because the South Side, once it desegregated, it split people up and sent people wherever they wanted to go. So Wilson Riles in the middle here, and then on the left, Sturgeon Cromer, the superintendent of the Flagstaff school system, said, look, we're going to desegregate before the federal government does it for us. So they got together, and by 1952, they had worked out a plan. But instead of implementing it immediately, they went and talked with the Black teachers and the Latino teachers and said, look, how are you going to be affected by this? Because we're going to desegregate. That means we're going to close your school. And they were like, well, we won't have jobs because of the rest of the city. They won't hire us. So they said, if you're concerned about that, we'll see if you have jobs. And so they took another year to make sure that all those teachers were going to be retained, so that when the students left and the schools were closed, that they could still have jobs. And they did this the year before the Supreme Court desegregated schools across the country. But again, it took a year for Flagstaff to get it together. Flagstaff, aside from education and jobs, is in the flood zone, as I mentioned. Once the Rio de Flag gets relocated, things will be improved, but insurance will go up because now you'll have a chance, will go down rather, because now you have a chance to rebuild outside of a flood zone. So here's a picture from 1983 that shows the runoff from the Rio de Flag during a high rain period. The geography of race and place still continues. Again, now it's no longer a vacuum of space, but actually a location where people call home. Here's the blank slate before that mural was painted. And I'd like to say that this is the type of blank slate that we should embrace, that we can put our own destiny in outlines and work forward from here. Because if we don't, then someone else would do it for us, and who knows what that picture would look like, right? The Southside specific plan is very much a model for how we can talk about this in a way that's productive. There may be complaints, there may be some concerns, but here is a location where people could go to explain themselves and what they wanted to see the city do. And here's from the preamble: the Southside Community and the City of Flagstaff will work in partnership to ensure that the city's growth and development will recognize the value and the contributions of Southside to the history of Flagstaff. And then they go on to talk about how that will do. Pretty groundbreaking stuff. And over a 2-year period, they had numerous meetings and discussions in town halls with people very similar to this before COVID. And they took all those ideas together. So I'm hoping we can use that plan as an idea. It's a wealth of knowledge that we can use. And out of that plan, as I mentioned, let me see if I can get to specific things that come there. I try to keep it down because it's a 2-volume thing, and it's very hard for us who are not geographers and city planners to plow through all that. So I like to tell stories, and here's the story. Southside has a high density residential area. It is zoned for residents. It's pretty high, but there are other zoning elements for businesses and for planning. There are no parks. So when we go through this neighborhood plan and we talk about race, place, and segregation, that's one of the things we want to look at. High density residential means that you can then have individual homes and multifamily homes. It doesn't mean that you have to have projects, right? But that's when we think of high density, that's what comes to mind. But affordable housing should be a goal of that as well. And we can talk about how that might happen. Second, partnerships to develop these city-owned properties. Yes, there are some city-owned properties within Southside that have not been developed fully. And those that have been developed, I think we do have some concerns that they may not be serving the people who will be there. It seems to be attracting other people who may not be permanent residents. And I'm not saying that students can't play that role, but many of the properties that come to be developed wind up being rental properties for the student population. And you can see what happens when you have an economic downturn. That economy goes away. So the whole idea of building Flagstaff's economy on student renting, that was a gamble. And we see the negative results of that right now in the COVID environment. It's very expensive to live here. But partnerships can show us what we can do. The same is true for business development. That is a way to help secure the history of the future of this location so that you will be able to turn a dollar within the community and it stays within the community. That would be the goal. I didn't put individual entrepreneurship on there, but that's what I would do right after this: business development, individual, innovative entrepreneurship. As I mentioned before, there are no parks. And so parks would have to be something that we want to include in a livable city. There will be an overpass construction that will allow there to be a connection to north of the tracks. And the Rio de Flag green space will be accommodated as it's relocated. But I think what we're looking at now, primarily when we think of the South Side, is historic preservation of our homes and our public buildings. And the Murdoch Center can be the center of that. In fact, that's what I would recommend, since there aren't a lot of recreation centers or schools that are active right now. It falls to the Murdoch Center. And so renovating that space can be a model for how we can renovate the rest of the city. And again, my own concern is, well, who owns that renovation? If it's still a city building, I'm not sure if we're really renovating and changing what it is that we're about. So part of that renovation has to be ownership of that space. And if you look at this plan, it doesn't quite get there, but we can get to it later when we talk about it. So Murdoch Center renovation, historic Black churches and other designated sites, same thing. If you renovate those Black churches, but those congregations are small and dwindling, have you really renovated the space? Do those churches get to hold onto their property? If you have 25 or 30 elders and maybe 10 or 15 students who are there on a rotating basis, it's very hard to sustain. But there is a need and an interest and an ability to make these historic Black churches and other designated sites part of a historic preservation. There's a need to that, just not to save a space and keep it empty and visit it as a museum, but actually the livable space. Okay. And of course, we've talked about the South Side as not just being a space where people pass through while going to NAU or getting to downtown. The links to transportation are pretty significant so that the people who live in those places are not seeing their streets as just a pass through. So that's what I mean by transportation and the road master plan, so that Coral's street, where her grandfather built a home, is not just where people cut through to get to NAU. All right, and of course, public improvements and the connection to the downtown center is very important, because we don't just live by ourselves in these areas. As I mentioned, we're connected. All right, I'm almost done here, folks. Reimagining the future South Side. We have to address those legacies of segregation, as I said, and I do insist that it's both negative and positive. You turn the segregation and discrimination into a way of congregating and creating value. And people did see value in those Black churches, in those Black schools, in those Black homes, in the restaurants, etc., that inundated the area. It's still the most diverse racially and ethnic demographics in the city, but it also has the lowest wealth, the lowest income, and the lowest level of home ownership. That has to change. Gentrification pressures will always be there, right? I'm hoping the tidal wave won't wipe people out, but it has to be a reality check to say, yeah, gentrification happens despite home preservation, despite historic preservation, so on and so forth. Because why? We don't own the areas that we live to a large percentage. And that could be the prime number there. So we also have to evaluate the relationship with the city of Flagstaff. If we have a progressive mayor like Mayor Coral, what happens to the next mayor and the mayor after that? Does the relationship with the city change? Well, it shouldn't. It shouldn't matter if you have a great mayor that you love and admire, or someone that you can't stand. They should still do the same job, whether you like them or not. That's what we expect. And I think that's the bar that makes it so hard to follow someone like Mayor Coral, because she's established a way of relating to the city that any mayor should do. Whether you like them or not, Republican, Democrat, Independent, that's the way you should have. And so let's evaluate that relationship. Can we have the same relationship after Mayor Coral and the city changes? We shall see. Partnerships, representation, and processes. How do we empower the residents and grow ownership in a big way? This Southside plan can be a model for that future engagement. I really do think that. It doesn't go far enough. It doesn't say the things I wanted to say, but so what? I'm just one person. I can say it's a model. Let's look what the future can imagine for us. Business development, not just consumer enterprises, not just pizza parlors and Starbucks and cappuccino shops, not just consumer enterprises, but innovation where enterprise can happen. That still has to be on the table. Not just art zones where people make pretty things in art lofts, but that could be part of it. Okay, there are other models in Sunnyside that we should look at and bring into the South Side. And then lastly, the two big elephants in the room, the Rio de Flag relocation and Northern Arizona University. That still has not been sorted out, if you ask me. And with the changeover in leadership, same thing. Should our relationship change with NAU, regardless of who the president is? Well, I'll leave that to you to discuss. I do have some questions that we can go through at the end of this. So this is the scaffolding that was built to try to do the mural, and we have to do the same thing here. What's the scaffolding to build a future relationship to the city? Here's people from across the city, both the students as well as some of the residents and some of the usual suspects who have come together to work on the mural. We also have to have that for building the future in a post-segregated society. I have some references here that I can share with you as we go forward. Some of them are videos that were put together over the years, and some of them have, like the Southside Neighborhood Plan. It's there for you to look at. And what I'll do is, if I may, I will. I wanted to switch my viewing so that you've got a chance to see this better, and then I'll pass the baton right here. Let's see if this is it. Let's see. Oops. I'll try that again. Share the screen. Live Black experience. see. I'll close these down and hopefully I'm screen sharing this thing. All right. Does that show up, Kara, as the issue statement?
It does, and the final version has just been shared to the chat as well.
Oh, good. Okay. All right, so you can follow along. This is the part that I discussed earlier on page 1. My references are the Southside Neighborhood Plan, the Historic Southside Mural, and the AZ Daily Sun reports. And then on the second page, I've got my context for low income, but that's where Black folks and people of color are. And the fun facts that Southside is still home to 4 historically Black churches. It was the segregated neighborhood for Blacks and Latinos for most of the 20th century, and the home to 2 segregated schools from the 1920s, the Dunbar School and the South Beaver School, both of which are closed. Just keep that in mind. They were neighborhood schools. There are no neighborhood schools now in Flagstaff, Southside rather. And so my key questions that I'd wanted to help lead through are there at the bottom. And what I'll do is, Kara, if you let me know that people want to go through this discussion individually or take their questions now. These are backups if you'd like, and we can go from there. Okay. That would be my presentation for now. Okay.
And we did have just one question for you, Dr. Guthrie. There was someone who asked if you could define the Pine Knoll neighborhood.
Yes. Okay, the Pine Knoll neighborhood. For those of you who travel to, let's say, from Northern Arizona University, going towards the, I want to say, Whole Foods restaurant and the Grove and the location there. So you're on Butler Street, and the major crossroad that you're going to pass is Lone Tree. If you turn right on Lone Tree and go down the hill, Pine Knolls is the area that is right below they call it the Lumber Mill Historic Park. Well, I guess there is a park there then, but it's on Lone Tree. It's across from the football fields that the NAU uses, and up in this neighborhood, Pine Knolls, there's a recreation center. I believe it's the YMCA now, and families traditionally lived there and went to Cogdill Recreation Center. Again, over 21%. So it is south of Route 66, but it's been considered its own location, Pine Knoll, rather than part of Southside. And the city has designated its own historic district for Southside that separates it from Pine Knoll. That's okay, just like they separated from Plaza Vieja. There are connections between those people who live in Pine Knoll near Cogdill that are connected to Southside. That's where they go to the churches in the Southside, they go to schools in the Southside. So I consider them part of the greater Southside area, although they are their own community, and it is heavily Black and Latino even today.